The whole town stood silent as Esther was dragged to the center of the square, her wrists bound with coarse rope and her lips bloodied from the last time she said no. Sheriff Weldon read aloud the verdict. Defiant, unmarriageable, unfit for a man's home. The elders nodded. The crowd, mostly men, said nothing. It was her father's idea, this punishment. He'd promised her to a widower with 4 sons and a cruel mouth. But when Esther stood her ground, refusing to marry a man twice her age who had struck her during courtship, her family called it shame. A woman who disobeys ruins the name of her kin, they said. And now, under the high summer sun, they would wash that shame clean. The lash was held by a hired man, rough, sunburned, indifferent. She could see him out of the corner of her eye, swinging it idly like he was bored. Around her, whispers stirred. Some voices she knew from the church choir, others from the general store. All quiet now, all watching. No one stepped forward, except one man who hadn't spoken a word since he arrived. He leaned against a fence post, a rancher's hat low over his eyes, dust still fresh on his boots. No one knew his name. He'd ridden into town 2 days prior, asked no questions, bought no supplies, just watched. Esther's jaw clenched as the whip cracked the air beside her, testing its reach. Her back was bare. They'd torn her dress down the spine and tied her to the post like a thief. But she still didn't cry. Her eyes scanned the crowd for her mother. Gone. For her brother. Hiding. No one dared defy the ruling. She bit her tongue as the first lash kissed her skin, a thin line of fire crossing her back. Her knees shook, but she didn't fall. She refused to let them have that. The second strike tore deeper. Blood began to pool at her waistband. Somewhere behind her, a child whimpered. A third lash drew gasps. Still she didn't scream. The fourth made her vision blur, and just as the man stepped forward to strike again, boots moved through the crowd. The rancher. He walked slow, deliberate, until he stood between the whip and the woman. "That's enough," he said, voice calm as dusk. The hired man froze. The sheriff blinked, but the stranger didn't flinch. Esther tried to lift her head. For the first time, someone had spoken. Not for the town. For her. The silence after his voice fell was louder than the whip itself. The rancher stepped forward, steady and unhurried, his eyes locked on the hired man's raised hand. "Drop it," he said again, voice quiet but edged like a blade. The man hesitated, long enough for Sheriff Weldon to clear his throat and step between them. "You're new here, stranger," the sheriff muttered, eyeing the crowd that now leaned in, unsure whether to cheer or tremble. "This is family justice. Ain't your concern." The rancher's gaze didn't shift. "I've seen justice. This ain't it." His boots creaked against the dirt as he moved closer to Esther, who was barely conscious now, back striped in red and breath coming in shallow bursts. The sheriff tried again. "She refused the man. Broke a lawful betrothal." The rancher didn't even blink. "Ain't a crime to say no." Then he reached up, calm as if untacking a horse, and began untying the knots that bound Esther's wrists. The ropes were wet with her sweat and blood. No one dared move. Some of the men looked at each other, uncertain, as if waking from a spell. "Who are you to interfere?" someone shouted from the back. "Who gave you the right?" The rancher finally turned to face them all, standing tall in the square. "Name's Silas Ward, and I'm her husband." Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind over wheat. Even Esther stirred at that, her head lifting an inch, her voice hoarse. "You... what?" Silas kept his eyes forward, jaw tight. "We were wed 3 days past. She came to me after she fled this town. told me everything. I brought her back to gather her things. I didn't know." He glanced down at her broken form. Didn't know they'd try to kill her for leaving a monster. The sheriff paled, suddenly unsure. If she was married, this punishment had no standing. The whole basis of the sentence unraveled like old rope. A few murmurs of, "Is it true?" ran through the crowd. She never said. Her pa kept it quiet. Silas didn't explain more. He just lifted Esther into his arms, gently as if she were made of glass. Blood smeared his shirt, but he didn't flinch. "You all should be ashamed," he said, staring into every eye that had watched. No one met his gaze, not even her father. And then Silas walked away, with Esther in his arms, and no one brave enough to stop him. Esther faded in and out as the horse galloped beneath them, her blood soaking into Silas's shoulder and the wind cold against her torn skin. She felt the rhythm of the animal's stride like a lullaby trying to calm her, but every jolt burned. Her arms hung limp around his neck. Once, her head slipped back, and he caught it gently, pressing her closer. "Almost there," he whispered, though she barely heard him. The last thing she remembered before darkness took her was the way his voice didn't tremble, not once. His cabin stood tucked between the hills, small but solid, built with his own hands. He pushed open the door with his boot, carried her in, and laid her on a cot he'd barely used himself. A wash basin waited nearby, fire already crackling. Everything ready. He hadn't known she'd need saving, but something deep in his bones had told him to prepare. He peeled the bloodied fabric from her back, careful not to tear what was left. Every lash mark was raw, raised, cruel, not punishment, torture, and she'd taken it without a sound. He soaked a cloth, wrung it out, and began to clean the wounds, whispering to her like she could still hear. "You're not property. You're not disgrace. You're not his." Each word came out heavy, like he was trying to lift the weight from her body himself. When she stirred, just barely, he paused. Her lips parted. A breath, then another. She blinked once, slowly, and her eyes tried to focus on the shape of the man beside her. "You said you were my husband," she croaked, voice like sand. He nodded, dipping the cloth again. "Only way I could stop them." "But you're not," she whispered. He hesitated, then looked her in the eye. "Number not unless you want it." Her gaze fluttered. The honesty stunned her more than the pain. "Why would you do that for me?" she asked, breath catching. He didn't smile, just said, "Because someone had to." And that was all. He moved to tend the fire, letting her rest, but even with the pain screaming across her back, a strange warmth began to rise in her chest. Not from the flames, from something quieter, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Safety. Silas didn't try to touch her, didn't demand thanks. He only watched from the chair by the hearth, eyes low, hat in his hands. He'd stepped in not to be a hero, but because his heart couldn't let her suffer 1 second longer. The next few days passed in a hush, like even the birds knew not to sing too loud near the cabin. Esther lay still most of the time, her back bandaged in soft linen, her movements slow and trembling. Silas kept to the edges of her world, chopping wood when the fire crackled too low, refilling water when her lips looked dry. He spoke only when needed, and never once touched her without asking. In that silence, trust had space to breathe. On the 4th morning, she tried to sit up. Her cry of pain drew Silas from outside in 2 strides. "Easy," he said, kneeling beside her. "You move too quick, you'll tear the skin again." She clenched her jaw. "I can't just lie here. I need to stand." He didn't argue, just offered his hand. She stared at it for a long moment before taking it. He helped her to her feet like she was made of feathers and porcelain. Light, fragile, sacred. She swayed, and his hand steadied her shoulders. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked, her voice small, her back straight with effort. Silas glanced toward the hills. "I tried the towns. Too loud, too much pretend." She smiled faintly. "You're not much for talking." "Never was." "I noticed." They shared a quiet laugh. Their first. Then Esther turned serious. "When I left home, I never meant to come back. I ran west to be free. I didn't think freedom would mean nearly dying." Silas's eyes darkened, not in anger, but in knowing. "Some men fear freedom in a woman, makes them violent." She nodded, and silence fell again. But it wasn't empty now. It was full of all the things they didn't need to say. Later, Silas showed her the garden out back. Tiny rows of carrots and beans, a patch of stubborn tomatoes. "You did all this?" she asked. "Little at a time." "It's enough." She meant more than the food. That evening, she sat by the fire instead of the bed. Silas brought her tea with honey, and they watched the flames like they were trying to memorize the shapes. When she leaned her head gently against the edge of his shoulder, he didn't move, just breathed a little deeper. That cabin had been waiting for someone. Not just a guest, not just a wife, a soul that knew silence and pain and chose to stay anyway. Esther wasn't healed, not yet. But for the first time, she didn't feel broken. It was just past noon when the knock came. 3 slow raps that didn't belong to any neighbor. Silas stood up from the table where he'd been teaching Esther how to cut apples without straining her back. Her hand froze mid-slice. "Stay here," he said low, reaching for the rifle that leaned by the door. When he opened it, the sheriff stood on the porch, thumbs hooked in his belt, eyes hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Silas," he drawled, "mind if I come in?" "That depends," Silas replied evenly. "What are you here for?" The sheriff took off his hat, tapping dust off the brim. "Word came down that a girl went missing from the Thompson spread. Said she ran off with a stranger during a disciplinary matter." Silas's jaw clenched. "That girl has a name. Then maybe she should tell me it herself." Esther had stepped into the doorway, back straight despite the wince she couldn't hide. The light caught her bruised face, the edge of a healing lash just visible beneath the collar of Silas's flannel shirt. "I'm Esther," she said clearly, "and I wasn't missing. I escaped." The sheriff blinked. "You look rough, but that don't mean—" "He whipped me for refusing to marry him," she said, voice rising. "The men in town watched. No one stopped it, except him." She nodded toward Silas, who hadn't moved. The sheriff scratched his jaw. "Look, I didn't come to stir trouble. Just need to know where the truth lies." "It lies in scars," Silas said, voice like steel. "And you've seen enough to know which way justice points." The sheriff looked between them, eyes softer now. He sighed. "Well, if Thompson comes looking, I'll say she left town. Don't mean he won't come himself, though." "Let him," Esther said before Silas could answer. "I won't run again." That night, they barely ate. The fire flickered as a storm gathered outside, wind moaning through the trees. Silas sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap. Esther joined him, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "He'll come, won't he?" she asked. "Most like." "Will you shoot him?" Silas didn't answer right away. "Only if I have to." She reached over, rested her hand on his. "Then I'll be ready too." He looked at her, really looked, and something passed between them, not love, not yet, but something deeper than fear, a promise. No more running, no more silence. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The rain hit the cabin roof in steady rhythm, drowning the silence neither of them dared to break. Esther stood by the stove, stirring a pot of beans. Her bruises faded to yellow, but the tension in her shoulders as tight as the first night. Silas sat by the window, watching the gray horizon, where the trail from town vanished into a forest of pine. "You ever live anywhere else?" she asked finally, her voice low but calm. "Kansas, before the war." "And after?" He looked over. "Didn't see much worth returning to." Esther nodded, setting the spoon down gently. "Same." They were quiet again until the horses came, not galloping, just the slow tread of two men riding heavy. Silas moved first, grabbing the rifle. "Stay back." But Esther already had the kitchen knife in her hand, firm grip, eyes fierce. "I'm done hiding." The riders came into view as silhouettes through the curtain of rain. One dismounted, tall, slick-haired, the kind of man who smiled like he owned the world. "Well, well," he called. "Ain't this cozy?" "Thompson," Silas muttered. Esther stepped beside him, lips white. "Esther," the man boomed, arms spread like they'd parted lovingly. "What a thing it is, to see you glowing. That rancher treating you better than I would have, I trust." "He's treating me like a human," she said. "That's more than you ever did." "Oh, come now," Thompson sneered. "You think that whipping was punishment? That was mercy, girl. Marrying me would have given you protection. You threw it away." "You mean I refuse to be bought?" she hissed. "I refuse to bleed for your pride." The second man dismounted, grizzled, older, clearly just a hired gun. Thompson kept smiling. "I came to offer you one last chance to come back. Don't think this farm's safe forever. You belong to me, Esther." Silas cocked the rifle. "No," he said. "She doesn't." "You gonna shoot me, rancher?" "If you take one step closer," Silas said evenly, "I'll bury you where you stand." Rain dripped from the porch beams. Esther gripped Silas's arm, not in fear, but in strength. Thompson glanced at the rifle, the fire in her eyes, and then at the storm still swelling behind him. "This ain't over," he growled. "It is for you," Esther said, "because if you come again, it won't be Silas who stops you. It'll be me." And somehow Thompson knew she meant it. He turned, mount grinding in the mud, and rode back into the storm. A week passed. The storm cleared, but Esther knew that threats didn't vanish with the clouds. She rose early, helped mend the corral, even learned to sling the rifle across her back the way Silas did. Trust didn't come easy, not for her, not for him, but something steady had begun to grow in the quiet spaces between danger. That morning, the lower pasture's fence was down, rails torn like they'd been stomped by hooves or yanked by hands. "Cattle?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Silas crouched beside a broken post, eyes sharp. "No tracks." "They wanted us to see this." Esther didn't flinch. "It's him again." Or someone paid by him. They spent the day repairing what they could, wire biting into calloused palms, and by dusk they were too sore to speak. Still, as she boiled water for tea, Esther looked up at the man seated by the hearth. "Why didn't you stop them sooner?" she asked softly. "That day in town. You watched a long time before stepping in." He didn't blink. "Because I've made mistakes before, Esther. I once stepped into someone else's fight and cost a boy his life. Thought maybe it wasn't my place this time." "And then?" "And then I saw your eyes," he said, "and I knew letting it happen would be worse." She set the tea down without drinking it. "You stepped in when it mattered. That's more than most." That night, they didn't lock the door, but left it ajar, a silent challenge to whoever thought fear still lived in that cabin. Around midnight, something rustled outside. Silas reached for his rifle. Esther already had her boots on. They moved together. No words, no panic. The porch creaked beneath their weight as they stepped into moonlight. A shadow darted behind the chicken coop. too small for Thompson. Silas raised his gun, but Esther held out a hand. Wait. A girl, no older than 12, barefoot and shivering, crawled into view. A bloodied rope still hung from her wrist. Esther dropped to her knees. It's okay. You're safe now. The girl looked at her like she didn't believe it yet. But she didn't run. Silas watched the two of them, something old and bitter inside him, softening. The past had returned in many forms lately. Rage, shame, fire. But maybe, just maybe, it had come back now as a chance, not to erase what was done, but to become something better. The girl's name was Lila, and the marks on her wrist told the same story Esther's back did. Property, punishment, silence. She hadn't spoken since they brought her in, only stared at the fire with wide, hollow eyes. Esther didn't press. She just sat beside her, brushing tangles from her hair and warming her fingers with broth. Silas boarded up the back shed to make room for Lila, but Esther insisted she stay in the cabin for now. She doesn't need another closed door. That morning, while gathering eggs, Esther saw movement down by the creek. Lila had wandered past the chicken pens to a weeping willow, whose roots drank from the waterbed. Esther followed slowly, hands open. Lila didn't run. She stood beneath the drooping branches, gazing at the sunlit ripples. This is where I used to hide, Esther said quietly. When I was small, when my father raised his voice. Lila looked at her. A moment passed. Then, without a word, she stepped closer and reached for Esther's hand. Esther gripped it gently, firmly. It was the first time Lila had touched anyone. Behind them, the ranch looked peaceful, wood smoke curling, animals grazing, but both women knew peace was fragile. Later, while fixing the porch rail, Silas found a folded note wedged between two planks. Esther's heart sank as she read the crude handwriting. Next time we take more than a fence. There was no signature, no need. Silas burned the note without a word. That night, Esther tucked Lila in and sat at the edge of the bed. You don't have to speak, not until you're ready, she whispered. But just know, you're not alone anymore. Lila blinked, a tear slipping down her cheek. When Esther turned to go, the girl's voice, quiet as a breath, said, "Thank you." Esther froze. Her chest ached. She turned back slowly, eyes meeting the girl's. "You're welcome, sweetheart." In the dark of the hallway, Silas waited. "They won't stop," he said. "I know." "Then we make them." Esther nodded. "But not with bullets, with something they can't take from us." "And what's that?" "A home," she said, "a safe one." That night, while the town slept behind locked doors and cold beds, 3 souls lay under one roof, wounded, wary, but beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were no longer victims of the world's cruelty. They were the start of something no whip could break. The sun had barely begun to dip when the clatter of hooves broke the quiet. Esther looked up from the wash tub, already sensing the shift in the air. Silas stepped onto the porch, rifle slung across his back but his eyes steady. From the tree line emerged 3 riders. One she recognized. Mayor Cartwell, all smug leather and silver trim, flanked by 2 deputies with the same familiar sneers. "We heard you were harboring a fugitive," Cartwell called out, staying atop his gelding. "A thieving girl who was pledged to a respected family. We've come to reclaim what was stolen." Silas didn't answer. Behind him, Lila peeked through the window, trembling. Esther stepped forward. "You're mistaken," she said firmly. "She's no fugitive. She's free, and she's under our roof now." Cartwell chuckled. "Freedom doesn't belong to everyone, Miss Esther. That girl was purchased, same as your silence once." Silas's grip tightened. "Leave." "Or what?" Cartwell taunted. "You'll shoot? You'll hang like your brother did, trying to play hero?" That name, Jeb, struck like lightning. The rancher's jaw clenched, pain flashing behind his eyes. "You beat a child and hung the man who tried to stop it," Silas said. "I was there, I watched, and I won't watch again." He stepped off the porch. Cartwell dismounted, ready to strike. Esther stepped in front of Silas before the men clashed. "You want to take her?" she said, voice steady. "Then do it the way you always have, publicly. But this time we'll bring the people. We'll show them what you call justice." Cartwell hesitated. The townsfolk had changed. Some had whispered, some had seen the bruises. His power, once absolute, now flickered with doubt. "You think they'll care about a mute girl and a washed-up woman?" he spat. "They already do," Esther said, "and so does the man behind me." Cartwell looked at Silas, who said nothing, but the rifle in his hand made the message clear. A long silence passed. Then Cartwell sneered and turned to mount his horse. "This isn't over." "No," Silas said, "it's just begun." As the riders disappeared into the trees, the breeze picked up, warm and full of dust. Esther exhaled, knees weakening beneath her. Silas caught her gently. "You all right?" he asked. "No," she said, tears slipping free. "But I've never felt braver." Behind them, Lila stepped out the front door and crossed the threshold of the porch, not just into sunlight, but into defiance. The wind that once carried screams across the prairie now rustled only through cottonwoods and hayfields. A full season had passed since Cartwell left the ranch in silence and never returned. His men, once feared, now sat idle under the scrutiny of a town that had finally begun to speak. And Lila, the girl once tied and beaten like an animal, now walked freely in the field beyond Silas's barn, skirts brushing wildflowers, her hair loose in the breeze. She didn't speak, not in words. But every look she gave to Esther and Silas carried volumes of trust, of peace, of a kind of healing no court or sermon had ever granted her. Esther watched her from the porch, mending a dress with quiet hands, her heart no longer knotted with fear. Silas emerged from the corral, sleeves rolled, jaw dusted with stubble. He came to sit beside her, boots creaking against the old wood. "Town wants us to testify next month," he said, eyes on the horizon. "Against Cartwell. They say what we've seen matters." Esther looked down at her stitching. "Do you think it will change anything?" He took the needle from her hand, set it down, and wrapped his fingers around hers. "It already has." She leaned into him, letting her head rest against his shoulder. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was sacred. Behind them, Lila sat cross-legged beneath the oak tree, carefully stringing beads Esther had found in an old trunk. She looked up, caught Esther's gaze, and offered a smile. Not shy, not broken, just real. Later that night, under stars so bright they looked like lanterns strung across the heavens, Esther stepped out to find Silas staring at the fire pit. "I keep thinking about the moment I stepped in," he said quietly. "It wasn't bravery, it was guilt. I waited too long." She moved beside him and took his hand. "But you stepped in," she whispered, "and no one else ever had." He looked down at their joined fingers. "You believe in second chances, Esther?" She nodded. "I do now." He turned to her, eyes soft but sure. "Then let's take one." She didn't answer with words. She simply stepped closer, wrapped her arms around his waist, and laid her head against his chest. Behind them, the door creaked open. Lila stood there, one hand on the frame, the other reaching forward. Esther extended hers. For the first time since they'd met, the girl took it. No more pain, no more silence. Just three hearts learning how to stay. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had seen her there, would you have stepped in too? Tell us in the comments.